of civic engagement around, say, white middle class civic engagement, which was not what I was intending to do, was the different ways in which people engage civically through a combination of, I think, habit, norms, opportunities, sort of practices that we're inducted into. So, for example, for a very long time, I was pretty resistant to the notion of public art as, especially like tagging and other things as a form of civic engagement. And I'm still, I go back and forth on it. It was actually a project that Mikva Challenge Kids did in Chicago that got me thinking about this really deeply when some students, this came out on your email a few years ago, some students had done something around a Martin Luther King statue. I think they got one put up in a local housing project because I think that was along that route or something. Yes, okay. And so I actually sent an email to a group of colleagues, Peter Levine and others, Jim Eunice, saying, so does this count as civic engagement? I mean, it's putting up a statue, and that's informative, but is it making a change in the world? And so that actually got us into a really profound discussion about civic engagement, and it really got me thinking hard about poetry slams, actually about Project Hip Hop and Hip Hop Nation and Rock the Vote and Vote or Die and all sorts of things. So that's a very long-winded answer to say, I don't really know. And part of what is troubling me, and part of the reason that I agreed when my students were challenging me on, say, norming white middle-class patterns of civic engagement, is that even though rates are higher, it's not, often there's not quite the same driving sense of justice, or, driving it as, say, with many, say, communities of color. And so, and driving notions of justice matter to me. So I think it's definitely the case that my students and I probably had very different notions of civic engagement at times. Also, my students often were very suspicious of civic engagement insofar as it seemed to be, say, going along with the power structure or sort of, agreeing, sort of giving credence to powers that were out there. And on the other hand, it remains really important to me to teach students how to access and make a difference through existing power structures. I think that's pretty huge.
Well, now to the teacher question. So I want to make a shout out to all the young people, especially the Mikva students that are here. You mentioned the idea of public work in your book. I'm going to quote from your book briefly. Public work is a notion that practical public effort by ordinary people in everyday environment has created what is of greatest value in our communities, and so is also the key to understanding both the nature of historical progress and the joys and obligations of citizenship. The school where I currently work at is an example of public work. In 2001, 14 members of the Little Village community went on a hunger strike to obtain a school that was badly needed in the community. So 7 years after the opening of the school, some of our students are forgetting about the struggle. And they do not see benefit in working together in order to solve problems in the community. Many express the desire of moving out of the community and moving to a better place. So my question is, how do you change that desire to leave the community and encourage students to stay engaged in the community and engage in public work?
A couple things. I think the most important way is by having them experience making change in the community. I mean, it's really hard and it's really time-consuming, and you're never guaranteed of success. And so you have to have enough experiences along the way that are positive, whether it's shared pizza and cookies after school often enough, or some kind of celebration, regardless of whether the struggle itself works. That they don't just say, "Ah, this was even worse than we thought," right? But no amount of exhortation on our parts, or even teaching history, what other people did, is going to convince young people, nor does it convince adults, that it is possible or worth it to put in the hard public work to make a difference. What we know from research, and what we know, I think, probably from our own experiences, is that what engages people in doing civic work and in getting civically engaged is actually the experience of civic engagement. Most people get pulled into civic participation not because they're passionate about it, or because they believe in the issue, or because they think it's their duty, but because somebody asked them. And I watched this myself. I mean, I am actually fairly civically engaged, and yet I've just been actually watching this sort of from a meta level for the last 3 weeks. I've been getting involved in the Elizabeth Warren Senate campaign in Massachusetts, and I've been getting involved in some stuff over revisions to Boston's school choice plan over the last few weeks. And every single one of those actions has come because somebody has asked me. Even though I'll be passionate about it, but somebody has said, Meira, will you host this meeting? Meira, will you go canvass? It was even just the experience of my husband saying to me, Meira, I just threw out my back trying to move the air conditioner out of the window, but don't you think you should take our girls to go canvass for Elizabeth Warren? I was actually going to take his throwing in his back with the excuse that none of us were going to go, but he asked me, and so I went. And this happens in sort of these micro ways and these much bigger ways. We as teachers have to ask our students again and again to get involved. And then we have to, help and show them how to do it. But I think that's what's going to do it. We can teach them inspiring stories about those who have done it themselves. And say, look, you've benefited, you directly benefited, you have this school. If they hadn't done that, you wouldn't have the school. But that's really different from the experience of doing it yourself and seeing, oh my gosh, it's made a difference. And then being asked again and again. One of the things that I talk about in the book is the fact that we basically ask kids to write, to read, to do math, to do science, to play baseball, to practice pitching or shooting hoops or whatever, sort of day after day after day, season after season after season, year after year after year. And yet, for some bizarre reason, we do not ask them to do citizenship, to be citizens, day after day after day, season after season after season, year after year after year. And that's what I think we have to do, because there's no reason to think that young people are going to, think that this is valuable on their own, learn how to do it on their own. We don't think that they're going to magically, learn how to use the FOIL method on their own, nor that they're magically going to think that it's really great to titrate on their own. And there's actually no reason to think that they'll magically think it's really good to go door to door or to organize a march and get permits, or even to put themselves out there with the principal and tell them why the principal's policies are wrong. Those are hard, and it's often frankly boring, and so we just got to get them to do it.
So a follow-up to that, though. So Sean and the Illinois Civic Mission Coalition works to create these or develop democracy schools in Illinois, schools that take on the civic mission, and John Schmidt and CPS and the Global Citizenship Initiative. So it's not just the civics course, it's a wraparound commitment of a school to develop young people, not just for college and career, but for citizenship. But Ruben and I were talking about how do you possibly teach democratic and civic participation in the most undemocratic institution I can think of? I mean, schools tend to be incredibly autocratic, teachers feel desperately unempowered, students feel like prisoners, so.
Yeah, I think that's actually the hardest piece of it. I mean, so many, when I was teaching 8th grade, I would occasionally get phone calls from people who would say were finishing up their PhDs, had just finished their PhDs, were assistant professors, for whatever reason they weren't sure they wanted to stay in academia, they were thinking about being high school teachers, I was teaching middle school, and they would say, Meira, talk to me about this, what is it like? And I said, you have to be really willing to shed your autonomy. I said, you know, one of the things about me personally is I'm actually very compliant. I really just don't mind so much conforming to rules. And therefore, I was quite a happy teacher because I just, you know, I could live with having dictates come down at me every single minute of every single day. But if you aren't that way, it's so hard. And in fact, you know, in being trained to be compliant and then maybe shut your door and, you know, do what you can inside the classroom, that's not a way to learn how to be civically empowered oneself, certainly not to model civic empowerment for one's students. So I think, you know, if you already have the drive, there are things you can do in a very undemocratic situation. You can close your classroom door and create more of a democratic, you know, ethos and culture in your classroom. You can actually have discussions. Diana Hess is the sort of national leader in this, right? And having real discussions with students about things that matter. That's so rare, and that's so essential for democracy. And you know, you can do that no matter what subject you're teaching, and no matter how autocratic your principal or your district or whatever are. And you can have class officers, and you can have a sense of ownership, and you can have students who take on different roles, etc. But I agree that you also have to get buy-in. You know, you have to, so much of what I was able to do with my students, like the citizenship projects that they did, were because my principal had my back. And I mean, it's just hard that way. And you do have to be able to give a better answer to your students about why we're doing this than because that's what I'm told to teach you, right? And whether that also means subversion to some extent on your part, I think is, that's just one of the things that's involved in public education in the United States these days.
Good teachers know how to be very subversive.
Exactly.
I think this is probably a good segue to the next question that I have for you. You mentioned in your book, when you talk about how students of color kind of battle with being who they are, their background, and being American. So W.E.B. Du Bois describes in his writing, The Soul of Black Folk, how difficult it is for African Americans to be both Black and American without being judged and having the door of opportunity roughly closed in their faces. Many African Americans feel that they cannot be Black and American. So I'm curious to know, what's your definition of what it means to be an American? And as a teacher, did you see your students of color battle with this double consciousness that Du Bois describes in his writing?
In a way, I think my definition of what it means to be an American, it's not that it's irrelevant, but it's essentially partial. So at one point when this book took me a decade to write for various reasons. At one point early on in this work, when I was really thinking about it in response to my teaching in Atlanta, when I was one of 6 white teachers in a school that had about, I don't know, 34, 35 African-American teachers and an entirely African-American student body. I thought I was writing a book about civic and multicultural education in de facto segregated schools. And specifically, I thought I was writing about those things with relationship to the question of what it meant to be American and questions of civic identity. That among political theorists, there was, and I think still is, this notion that civic identity is what we share. And that, you know, that being American is something that we all have in common. And then there are other things that, you know, we don't necessarily have in common. And my experience those 3 years teaching in Atlanta demonstrated to me just how false that was, right? My experience of being American, in part by virtue of my whiteness, was so different from my students and my colleagues' experiences of being American, that that being American was not a shared civic identity. Yes, we were all, virtually all American citizens, and we shared in that legal relationship. But what it meant to me to be American was just different from what it meant to many others to be American. And I've seen that again, when I started teaching in Boston. And so I never wrote that book that was about, the argument was going to be that there is no shared civic identity, that we're just sort of these overlapping circles. You can think of like a Venn diagram on an infinite plane, and so everybody shares with somebody, but most of the circles don't overlap at all. But I think, therefore, my view of being American is just necessarily partial. There was a second part to your question. Oh, about
Yes.
Du Bois and double consciousness. So the other thing that I'll say is, as you know, one of the things that I argue in chapter 2 of the book, which is the chapter that's most explicitly about race, is that I think that ideally we would actually teach all people to sort of force all people into that kind of double consciousness. We are not in a world in which African Americans can shed double consciousness, right? That's just not a world that exists right now. And I think it would be far better, though, if all of us, say living in the United States, were forced to habitually have this kind of double consciousness, where none of us could assume that we were normal, that that we could have a single consciousness and that we compared others to, that others had to kind of come into our view. I mean, that was one of the most profound experiences for me as a teacher, was, and I think this is probably true for every teacher, you are constantly seeing yourself through your students' eyes, right? And usually seeing yourself badly, right? You come off as a dork and all sorts of things. But that's a really important experience as a teacher. And it's what helps you be a better teacher, because it's your students' conceptions of the world that you're trying to engage with and change. And also because I was teaching as a white teacher in a predominantly non-white classroom all the time, that meant that I was forced to engage also in a kind of racial double consciousness. And I think that was really good for me. And that is a kind of double consciousness I think I've retained even after teaching. So I think that we should all end up with that kind of double consciousness.
Staying on this on topic of race and identity, you argue that you are in favor of teaching that, and I quote, that the U.S. was founded in the original sin of racism and discrimination, but that holds out the hope of redemption via struggle because of its accompanying founding ideals of equality and liberty. You also state that counter narrative should not be considered as the new American civic narrative. I have always wondered, what if I pick up my curriculum and start teaching in a more fluid high school, which my curriculum focuses on just that: racism, discrimination, struggle, equality, and liberty. How do teachers go about teaching U.S. history, which reflects all of students' experiences, all of their students' experiences?
So let me distinguish between, so when I say that narrative should not become the new American civic narrative, that's for a couple of reasons. One is that I worry that if it does, it will become as defanged and powerless as the moderately triumphalist narrative that I talk about sort of earlier in that chapter. So this is the chapter in which I talk about how we should teach history and sort of help students construct an empowering civic narrative within thinking about history and American history. And I think that, say, I can imagine, with all due respect to them, Pearson, McGraw-Hill, Houghton Mifflin, etc., saying, okay, it's about struggle, opportunity, and obligation, and having little sidebars about struggle and opportunity and obligation. Exactly, and precisely, yes. And for more on this, click here. And that it will just become as anodyne and disempowering and disaffecting and boring as what we pass for teaching American history now. But so that is not to say, though, that we should not be teaching about racism, about sexism, about Native American genocide, about all sorts of things, wherever we are teaching. But it is to say that in addition to our not wanting to, say, adopt a new civic narrative that will then become, Pearsonized and McGraw-Hillized, we also have to recognize that students come to history, they come to what they do in school with their own construction of meaning, of their lives, of the lives of their families, their communities, their cultures, etc. And so we can no more impose on kids a narrative of struggle, opportunity, and obligation than we can successfully impose on them a narrative of moderate triumphalism. That, we all have different personal histories, experiences, family histories, experiences, etc. And it is through those lenses that we come to understand what we are being taught in school, including often rejecting what we're being taught in school as merely school knowledge. All right, I'll tell it back to the teacher, but they don't really know what it's like. They're not telling it as it is. And that's a really good way to then forget it the day after the test or the day after graduation or whatever. So in that respect, I think we need to be really responsive to how our students themselves are thinking and understanding their lives and help them construct a narrative that engages them while still being true to, what actually, there is historical truth. It may all be partial, it may all be, etc. But it's a complicated, really challenging dance. But I think that's what we
So similar to how it always was in class, you probably have this over plan, all these questions I want to ask, but I know you guys do too. But we also, and I realized we didn't do our introductions, and we're not as interested. But, so my name is Jill Bass, and I work for